Rain poured heavily that night, the kind that blurred the edges of everything, turning the city into a canvas of shadows and streaks of light. My chest burned as I ran through the empty streets, my heart pounding louder than the thunder above. My hands trembled, clutching the phone as if it held the answers I needed. His name was the only thing on my lips, whispered between gasps of breath, over and over, like a prayer I was too scared to let go of. The ache in my legs was nothing compared to the weight in my chest, a crushing mix of fear, guilt, and helplessness. It felt unreal, like a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. How could this happen to him, of all people? He was my protector, my rock, the one who never faltered no matter what life threw at him. He had faced storms far worse than this, and always came out stronger. And yet, there I was, stumbling through the rain, desperate to reach him. I thought of his voice, steady and comforting, saying, "I've got you. Always." He had kept that promise so many times, standing between me and every danger, every hurt. But tonight, he wasn't there to shield me. Tonight, he was the one who needed saving, and I wasn't sure if I could reach him in time. Mind raced back to the last time I had seen him, just hours ago. His smile had been there, faint but genuine, as he told me not to worry about anything. "I'm fine," he had said. How many times had I believed those words? Even. The streetlights flickered above, casting eerie shadows that danced on the wet pavement. When I knew better? There was always something in his eyes, a weight he carried but never shared. I had ignored it, convincing myself that he was invincible, that he didn't need my help. Now, that lie felt like a noose tightening around my throat. The phone buzzed in my hand, jolting me back to the present. A name flashed on the screen, one I barely registered as I swiped to answer. The voice on the other end was frantic, words tumbling over each other, but I barely heard them. All I caught were the fragments. "Collapsed. Critical. You need to come now." My knees nearly buckled as the realization hit me like a wave. This wasn't just a bad moment. This was something far worse. I pushed forward, the rain soaking through my clothes and chilling me to the bone. Every step felt heavier than the last, each one carrying the weight of my regrets. Why hadn't I seen it sooner? The signs were all there, the late nights, the quiet moments where he seemed lost in thought, the subtle shifts in his smile. He had been hiding something, and I had let him. I had let myself believe he didn't need me, that he could handle anything on his own. But now, I knew the truth. He had been protecting me from more than just the outside world. He had been protecting me from himself. "He's in the ICU," she said, her voice calm but distant. "Second floor, take the elevator on the right." ICU. The words made my stomach churn, the reality sinking deeper with each passing second. My feet moved on their own, carrying me toward the elevator, the sound of my wet shoes squeaking against the polished floor echoing in the silence. I pressed the button for the second floor, my reflection in the elevator door catching my eye. I looked like a mess, hair plastered to my face, eyes wide and red, lips trembling. But none of it mattered. All I could think about was him. The elevator ride felt endless, the soft hum of the machinery amplifying the storm in my head. Memories played like a broken reel. His laugh, his reassuring words, the way he had always been my constant. It felt impossible that he was behind those sterile doors, hooked up to machines, fighting for his life. I clenched my fists, trying to push the thoughts away, but they clawed their way back, relentless and cruel. When the elevator doors slid open, I stepped into the hallway, my breath catching at the sight before me. The ICU was lined with glass doors, each room a small, contained world of monitors and wires. A nurse approached me, her face kind but guarded. "Are you here for someone?" she asked gently. I nodded, my voice barely coming out. "Yes, he's in here. He's my..." The words caught in my throat. What was he to me? My protector? My family? He was everything, but no single word could capture that. His name is Adil, I managed finally. The nurse's expression shifted slightly, her eyes softening. Follow me, she said, leading me down the hallway. Each step felt heavier than the last, my heart thudding painfully in my chest. When she stopped in front of a door, I froze. She turned to me, her voice quiet but firm. He's stable for now, but he's been through a lot. You can go in, but please don't overwhelm him. I nodded, my hand hovering over the door handle. For a moment, I couldn't move. I didn't know what I was about to see, and part of me wasn't ready. The man who had always seemed so unbreakable, the one who had been my shield against everything the world threw at me, what would he look like now? Would he still be the same? Taking a deep breath, I pushed the door open. The beeping of monitors was the first thing I noticed, a steady rhythm that both reassured and terrified me. And then, I saw him. Adil. The sight stole the air from my lungs. He lay on the bed, pale and fragile, his face lined with exhaustion and pain. Wires and tubes surrounded him, each one a lifeline tethering him to the world. For a moment, I couldn't move. My knees felt weak, my hands clutching the doorframe for support. This wasn't the Adil I knew. This wasn't the strong, unwavering presence I had leaned on my entire life. He looked so small, so vulnerable, and it broke me in ways I couldn't describe. Adil, I whispered, my voice cracking as I stepped closer. His eyes fluttered open, and for a moment they struggled to focus. But then, he saw me. A faint smile tugged at his lips, weak but unmistakably him. You came, he said softly, his voice barely audible. Tears blurred my vision as I nodded. Of course I came. I'll always come for you. But even as I said it, a terrible thought crept into my mind, unbidden and cruel. Had I come too late? Adil's smile faded quickly, replaced by a flicker of pain as his breathing grew uneven. I rushed to his side, gripping his hand gently, afraid I might hurt him if I held too tightly. His hand felt cold, fragile, so different from the warmth and strength I had always known. I searched his face, desperate for a sign that he would be okay, but the weariness in his eyes was impossible to ignore. You don't have to look at me like that, he said, his voice hoarse but laced with the same quiet strength that had always comforted me. I'm still here, aren't I? I forced a smile, but the lump in my throat made it hard to respond. You scared me, I managed, my voice barely steady. What happened? Why didn't you tell me you weren't okay? He chuckled faintly, the sound so weak it only made my chest tighten more. You had enough on your plate. I didn't want to burden you. I shook my head, anger and guilt bubbling inside me. How could you think that? After everything you've done for me, how could you think I wouldn't want to help you? Adil's gaze softened, his eyes meeting mine with an intensity that felt almost like an apology. Because that's what I do, he said simply. I protect you. That's all I've ever wanted to do. Tears spilled down my cheeks as I gripped his hand tighter, my own trembling. You didn't have to do it alone, I said, my voice breaking. I should have seen it. I should have known. Adil closed his eyes briefly, his breathing shallow but steady. You've always seen the best in me, he murmured, even when I didn't deserve it. But sometimes, protecting someone means keeping them away from the worst of it. That's all I ever wanted for you. His words cut through me like a blade, leaving a deep, aching wound. I thought back to all the times he had brushed off his own struggles, his own pain, just to make sure I was okay. I had let him carry the weight of the world on his shoulders, never once questioning how much it was crushing him. And now, as he lay there, hooked up to machines, I couldn't escape the bitter truth. I had been blind. I'm not a kid anymore, I said softly, my voice trembling. You don't have to protect me like that. I'm supposed to protect you too. Adil's lips curved into a faint smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. You already have, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. In ways you don't even realize. Before I could respond, a nurse stepped into the room, her expression calm but firm. I'm sorry, but we need to check his vitals now, she said, glancing between us. You can wait outside for a bit. I hesitated, my grip on Adil's hand tightening briefly. He gave me a faint nod, as if to say it was okay. Reluctantly, I let go and stepped out of the room, my legs feeling unsteady beneath me. The hallway seemed colder than before, the sterile lights too bright, too harsh. I leaned against the wall, pressing my hands to my face as the tears came freely now. The guilt weighed heavily on me, a crushing burden that refused to let go. How had I not seen it? How had I let him hide so much from me? He had always been my shield, my savior, but in doing so, he had hidden his own battles. And now, I didn't know if I could save him. As I stood there, lost in my thoughts, a voice broke through the haze. You look like you've seen a ghost. I turned to see an older man sitting on a bench nearby, his face lined with age and experience. He studied me for a moment, then added, Whatever it is, you don't have to carry it alone. The words hit me harder than I expected, stirring something deep inside. Adil had carried everything alone for so long, and now it was my turn to shoulder the weight. But was it too late? I sat down on the cold bench beside the man, my mind too heavy to form a reply. He didn't press further, simply offering a kind smile before leaning back, his eyes fixed on some distant point down the hallway. His presence was oddly calming, even though the storm in my chest refused to settle. Minutes passed like hours, and then the nurse emerged from Adil's room. I shot to my feet, scanning her face for any sign of news. She offered a small nod, her tone professional but gentle. You can go back in now. He's stable, but don't push him too hard. He needs rest. I thanked her quietly and stepped back into the room, closing the door behind me. Adil's eyes were open, but he looked even more drained than before, his chest rising and falling with an unsettling rhythm. I hesitated. The words I wanted to say tangled in my throat. He noticed and gave me the smallest of smiles, as if trying to reassure me even now. You don't have to stand there looking guilty, he said, his voice weak but teasing. You're making me feel like I'm already dead. Don't say that, I snapped, harsher than I intended. My voice softened immediately. Please, don't joke like that. He closed his eyes for a moment, as if gathering what little strength he had. When he opened them again, there was a glimmer of something I couldn't quite place. Regret, maybe, or a weight he'd been carrying for far too long. There's something I need to tell you, he said quietly. I stepped closer, pulling the chair next to his bed and sitting down. My hands fidgeted in my lap as I waited for him to continue. You don't have to say anything right now, I said, trying to stop him. You should rest. But he shook his head slightly, his lips pressing together as if he feared he might run out of time. No, he said firmly, though his voice remained soft. I need to say this. You deserve to know. My heart raced as I leaned forward, hanging on his every word. He took a shallow breath, his fingers twitching slightly against the blanket. You've always looked at me like I was this unbreakable force, he began, his gaze meeting mine. But the truth is, I've been breaking for a long time. The weight of his words hit me like a blow, and I felt my breath catch in my throat. Adil, I whispered, but he held up a weak hand to stop me. Let me finish, he said. You've always seen me as someone who could handle anything, and I wanted you to see me that way. I wanted to be strong for you, to give you the kind of protection I never had. But somewhere along the way, I forgot how to let anyone else in. I thought if I kept carrying it all, you'd never have to. Tears blurred my vision, and I reached out to take his hand in mine. You didn't have to do that, I said, my voice trembling. You didn't have to carry everything alone. I would have helped you. He smiled faintly, his thumb brushing against my fingers. I know you would have, but I didn't want you to. I didn't want you to feel the weight I've felt my whole life. I shook my head, the tears falling freely now. But look where it's brought us, I said, my voice cracking. You're lying here, and I don't know how to fix this. His eyes softened, and for a moment, the old Adil was there. The one who had always seemed so sure of everything. It's not your job to fix me, he said. It never was. All I wanted was for you to live without the burdens I carried. If I've done that, then it's enough. It wasn't enough for me. Not now, not when the reality of his frailty was staring me in the face. But before I could say anything, he squeezed my hand lightly and closed his eyes, his breathing evening out as sleep overtook him. I sat there in silence, watching him, my mind racing with a mix of anger, sadness, and helplessness. He had given everything for me, but in doing so, he had slowly unraveled himself. And now, as I watched the rise and fall of his chest, I couldn't shake the feeling that time was slipping through my fingers, no matter how tightly I tried to hold on. The room grew quieter as Adil drifted into a restless sleep, the faint beeping of monitors filling the air. I stayed by his side, watching his chest rise and fall, my thoughts spinning in endless loops. The weight of his words pressed down on me. He had been breaking for so long, carrying burdens I hadn't even seen, all for my sake. I thought I had known him, truly known him, but now it felt like I had only seen the surface. My fingers tightened around his, careful not to wake him. I wanted to hold on, to tether him to me as if my touch could keep him from slipping away. But even as I sat there, the cracks in my resolve deepened. Guilt clawed at me. I should have been there for him. I should have noticed. Memories flooded my mind, each one sharper than the last. The way he had always brushed off my questions about his well-being, turning the conversation back to me. The quiet moments when he thought I wasn't looking, when his shoulders sagged under the weight of something he refused to share. The way he always smiled through the pain, convincing me everything was fine. And I had let myself believe it. A soft knock at the door startled me, and I turned to see the older man from the hallway standing there. He held a cup of tea in his hand, his expression a mixture of curiosity and quiet understanding. I thought you might need this, he said, stepping inside. I hesitated, then nodded, accepting the cup with a murmured, "Thank you." He pulled up a chair across the room, settling into it like he had all the time in the world. For a moment, neither of us spoke, the silence heavy, but not uncomfortable. He seems like a good man, the stranger said finally, his voice low. Your father? I shook my head, surprised by how easily the correction came. He's my everything, my family, my protector, I trailed off, realizing I couldn't quite put into words what Adil was to me. He was more than any single label could define. The man nodded thoughtfully, his gaze drifting to Adil. Sometimes the ones who protect us the most are the ones who need the most protecting, he said, almost to himself. His words struck a chord deep within me, and I looked down at the tea in my hands, the warmth seeping into my fingers. I didn't see it, I admitted quietly. He hid so much from me, and I let him. I thought he was strong enough to handle anything. The man leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. Strength isn't about handling everything on your own, he said. It's about knowing when to let someone else carry the load with you. He didn't let you because he didn't want to, not because you weren't strong enough to help. I swallowed hard, my throat tight. But now I don't know if it's too late, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. I don't know if I can save him. The man's gaze softened and he shook his head. Saving isn't always about fixing what's broken. Sometimes it's about being there, even when you feel helpless. Just letting someone know they're not alone can be enough. I glanced at Adil, his face pale and fragile in the harsh light of the hospital room. His breaths came slow and steady now, but the faint lines of pain etched into his features remained. The man's words stayed with me, lingering like an echo in the back of my mind. Maybe I couldn't undo the damage. Maybe I couldn't take away his pain. But I could be here. I could let him know that he didn't have to carry this alone anymore. The stranger rose to his feet, smoothing out his jacket. I'll leave you to him, he said, his tone gentle. But remember, just being here matters more than you think. As he left, the door clicking softly behind him, I sat there in silence, his words resonating within me. For the first time, I felt a small spark of clarity. I couldn't change the past, but I could change what came next. I leaned forward, resting my hand lightly on Adil's, and whispered, I'm here. I'm not leaving. Not now, not ever. His fingers twitched slightly, a faint response even in his sleep. It wasn't much, but it was enough. And for now, that had to be enough. The hours blurred together as I sat by Adil's bedside, the steady rhythm of the monitors the only sound in the room. Each beep felt like a lifeline, tethering him to me, reminding me he was still here. My mind refused to quiet down, memories and questions swirling endlessly. How had he managed to hide so much for so long? And why hadn't I pushed harder to see through the facade he had built so carefully? Adil stirred slightly, his eyelids fluttering open. His gaze was unfocused at first, but then it settled on me. A small, tired smile tugged at the corners of his lips. You're still here, he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. I leaned closer, brushing a strand of hair from his forehead. Of course I'm here, I said softly. Where else would I be? He let out a faint chuckle, though it sounded more like a sigh. You should rest. You don't need to sit here all night. I'm not going anywhere, I replied firmly, my voice laced with determination. Not this time. He didn't argue, his eyes closing briefly as if the effort of keeping them open was too much. You're stubborn, you know that? He muttered, his tone teasing, but weak. A smile broke through my own exhaustion, though it was bittersweet. I learned from the best, I said, squeezing his hand gently. For a moment, silence filled the room again, comfortable but heavy with unspoken words. I watched his chest rise and fall, each breath a fragile promise. My heart ached with the need to say something, to fill the space with meaning, but I didn't know where to start. Adil was the one who finally broke the quiet. I know you're angry with me, he said, his eyes still closed. And you have every right to be. I shook my head, even though he couldn't see it. I'm not angry, I said quietly. I'm scared of losing you. His hand tightened slightly around mine, a gesture so small yet filled with reassurance. You won't lose me, he said, though the tremor in his voice betrayed him. Not yet. The words felt like a double-edged sword, offering comfort and cutting deep at the same time. Why didn't you tell me? I asked, the question slipping out before I could stop it. Why did you think you had to do this alone? He opened his eyes again, his gaze meeting mine. There was a raw honesty there, an openness I hadn't seen before. Because I didn't want you to worry, he admitted. I didn't want you to feel the weight of my problems. You've already been through so much. I didn't want to add to it. His words stung, not because they were unkind, but because they carried so much truth. I had leaned on him for everything, trusted him to be my strength when I felt weak, and in doing so, I had let him carry more than anyone should. But I'm not a child anymore, I said, my voice trembling. You don't have to protect me like that. You don't have to carry everything on your own. Adil smiled faintly, his expression softening. Old habits die hard, he said. You were just a kid when we met. You needed someone to look out for you. It became second nature after a while. Tears welled in my eyes as I listened, my heart breaking all over again. I don't need you to protect me anymore, I said, my voice cracking. I need you to let me be there for you. I need you to let me help. He didn't respond right away, his eyes closing again as he seemed to think about my words. Finally, he nodded, the movement slight but deliberate. All right, he said softly, but only if you promise me one thing. Anything, I said, leaning closer. Promise me you'll take care of yourself too, he said. Don't lose yourself trying to save me. I swallowed hard, the tears spilling over as I nodded. I promise, I whispered, though the words felt heavy with uncertainty. I wasn't sure if I could keep that promise, not when the fear of losing him consumed me. But for now, it was enough to say it, to let him believe it. He smiled again, his grip on my hand relaxing as sleep began to claim him once more. I stayed by his side, my heart heavy, but resolute. Whatever came next, I wouldn't let him carry it alone. Not anymore. The night dragged on, the minutes stretching into hours as I stayed by Adil's side. His breathing was steady but shallow, his face pale and drawn. I tried to focus on the rhythm of the monitors, letting their steady beeps remind me he was still here. But my mind kept wandering, replaying the past with cruel precision. Every time I thought I had pushed the memories away, they clawed their way back, relentless and accusing. I thought of the first time Adil had stepped into my life. I was a frightened, lonely child, unsure of who to trust. He had shown up like a force of nature, unshakable and steady, offering me a sense of safety I hadn't known before. Over the years, he had become my shield, my confidant, my entire world. But now, as I watched him lying there, fragile and vulnerable, I realized how little I truly knew about him. A knock at the door startled me from my thoughts. I turned to see the nurse from earlier, her expression kind but serious. I need to talk to you, she said softly, motioning for me to step outside. Reluctantly, I let go of Adil's hand and followed her into the hallway. The harsh fluorescent lights felt blinding after the dim glow of the room. The nurse closed the door gently behind us, her demeanor professional but compassionate. We've run some tests, she began, her voice low. His condition is stable for now, but there are complications. His body is weak, and he's been ignoring the signs for too long. Whatever he's been dealing with, it's taken a significant toll. I swallowed hard, my chest tightening with every word. What does that mean? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. What are his chances? The nurse hesitated, her gaze softening. It's hard to say. He's a fighter, but his body is exhausted. Right now, what he needs most is rest and support. The emotional strain he's been under has likely contributed to his physical decline. Her words felt like a punch to the gut. Emotional strain. I thought back to all the times Adil had brushed off my questions, hiding his struggles behind that familiar, reassuring smile. How many of those burdens had been mine? How much of his pain had he absorbed just to spare me? Is there anything I can do? I asked, my voice trembling. Anything at all? The nurse placed a gentle hand on my shoulder. Be here for him, she said. Let him know he's not alone. Sometimes that's the most powerful medicine we can offer. I nodded, unable to speak as a lump formed in my throat. The nurse gave me a small, encouraging smile before walking away, leaving me alone in the hallway. I leaned against the wall, taking deep, shaky breaths as I tried to steady myself. The weight of her words pressed down on me, heavier than I could bear. Adil had spent his life shielding me, sacrificing himself piece by piece, so I wouldn't have to feel the pain he carried. And now, he was paying the price. When I finally stepped back into the room, Adil was still asleep, his chest rising and falling in a fragile rhythm. I sat down beside him, taking his hand in mine once more. The warmth of his skin, faint as it was, grounded me. I thought of what the nurse had said, how being here might be the only thing I could do for him now. I leaned closer, my voice barely above a whisper as I spoke. "You don't have to fight alone anymore," I said, tears streaming down my face. "I'm here, Adil. I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere, no matter what." His fingers twitched faintly in response, the smallest gesture. But it was enough. In that moment, I realized that even if I couldn't save him the way he had always saved me, I could still fight for him. And for now, that had to be enough. The next morning came slowly, the gray light of dawn creeping through the window. I hadn't slept, not even for a moment. My eyes burned, my body ached, but I stayed by Adil's side, my hand still holding his. The faint warmth of his skin was the only thing keeping me tethered to reality. Adil stirred, his eyelids fluttering open. His gaze found mine almost immediately, and despite his exhaustion, he offered a small, faint smile. "Morning," he murmured, his voice rough from sleep. "Morning," I replied softly, brushing my thumb over the back of his hand. "How are you feeling?" He closed his eyes briefly, as if even answering the question took effort. "Like I've been hit by a truck?" he said with a weak chuckle. "But I'm still here." I nodded, forcing a smile I didn't feel. "You scared me," I admitted. "Last night, I thought—" My voice broke and I looked away, unable to finish the sentence. "You thought I wouldn't make it," he said, finishing the thought for me. His tone wasn't accusatory, just quiet and matter-of-fact. "I'm sorry I put you through that." I shook my head, my grip on his hand tightening. "Don't apologize," I said firmly. "You're the one lying here, fighting for your life. I should have seen what was happening. I should have been there for you." Adil sighed, his eyes closing again. "I never wanted you to see it," he said. "That was the point. I wanted you to live your life without worrying about me." "But I do worry," I said, my voice rising slightly. "I've always worried about you. I thought you were strong enough to handle everything. I thought you didn't need me." His eyes opened again, and this time, there was a hint of frustration in them. "That's what I wanted you to think," he said. "I wanted to be the strong one, the one you could rely on. I didn't want you to see me like this." "Well, I see you now," I said, my voice trembling with emotion. "And I'm not going to let you push me away anymore. You've spent your whole life protecting me, Adil. Let me protect you for once." He looked at me for a long moment, his expression softening. "You're stubborn," he said quietly, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "I learned from the best," I replied, echoing the words I'd said the night before. The room fell silent again, but this time, it wasn't as heavy. There was a strange comfort in the quiet, as if we were finally beginning to understand each other in a way we never had before. I didn't know what the future held or how much time we had left, but I knew one thing for certain. I wasn't going to waste another second pretending everything was fine. Adil closed his eyes again, his breathing steady but shallow. I stayed where I was, my hand still holding his, my resolve hardening with every passing moment. He had spent his life being my shield, my strength, my constant. And now, it was my turn to do the same for him. Whatever it took, however hard it became, I wasn't going to let him face this alone. Not anymore. The morning stretched on, the soft hum of the machines filling the room as I sat quietly by Adil's side. Nurses came and went, their movements efficient and purposeful, but none of them lingered. Each time the door clicked shut, The room seemed to grow smaller, the weight of everything pressing in on me. Adil drifted in and out of sleep, his face pale and drawn, his breath shallow but steady. As the sunlight began to stream weakly through the window, a sudden thought gripped me. There were things I didn't know about him, things I had never asked. He had been my protector for so long that I had taken him for granted, assuming there would always be more time to understand the man behind the role he played in my life. But what if there wasn't? What if time was running out faster than I could hold on to it? "Adil," I said softly, leaning closer. His eyes fluttered open, and he turned his head slightly toward me, his gaze heavy with fatigue. He murmured, his voice barely audible. "There's something I need to know," I began, hesitating as I tried to find the right words. "Why did you take me in? All those years ago when you didn't have to, why did you do it?" He blinked slowly, his lips curving into a faint, wistful smile. "You really want to talk about that now?" he asked, his voice weak but teasing. "Yes," I said firmly. "I need to know. I need to understand." He was quiet for a moment, his eyes drifting toward the ceiling, as if he were searching for the right place to begin. "You reminded me of myself," he said finally, his voice soft but steady. "Lost, alone, angry at the world but too scared to show it. I saw you and I thought, if someone had been there for me, maybe my life would have turned out differently." His words struck a chord deep within me, and I felt a lump rise in my throat. "But you didn't have to do what you did," I said. "You gave me everything, even when you didn't have much to give." Adil's gaze shifted back to me, and there was a flicker of something in his eyes, a mix of sadness and pride. "You deserved better than the hand you were dealt," he said. "I couldn't change my own past, but I could make sure you had a future. That was enough for me. He closed his eyes briefly, as if even answering the question took effort. "Like I've been hit by a truck," he said with a weak chuckle. "But I'm still here." I nodded, forcing a smile I didn't feel. "You scared me," I admitted. "Last night? I thought—" My voice broke, and I looked away, unable to finish the sentence. "You thought I wouldn't make it," he said, finishing the thought for me. His tone wasn't accusatory, just quiet and matter-of-fact. "I'm sorry I put you through that." I shook my head, my grip on his hand tightening. "Don't apologize," I said firmly. "You're the one lying here, fighting for your life. I should have seen what was happening. I should have been there for you." Adil sighed, his eyes closing again. "I never wanted you to see it," he said. "That was the point. I wanted you to live your life without worrying about me." "But I do worry," I said, my voice rising slightly. "I've always worried about you. I thought you were strong enough to handle everything. I thought you didn't need me." His eyes opened again, and this time there was a hint of frustration in them. "That's what I wanted you to think," he said. "I wanted to be the strong one, the one you could rely on. I didn't want you to see me like this." "Well, I see you now," I said, my voice trembling with emotion. "And I'm not going to let you push me away anymore. You've spent your whole life protecting me, Adil. Let me protect you for once." He looked at me for a long moment, his expression softening. "You're stubborn," he said quietly, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "I learned from the best," I replied, echoing the words I'd said the night before. The room fell silent again, but this time it wasn't as heavy. There was a strange comfort in the quiet, as if we were finally beginning to understand each other in a way we never had before. I didn't know what the future held or how much time we had left, but I knew one thing for certain. I wasn't going to waste another second pretending everything was fine. Adil closed his eyes again, his breathing steady but shallow. I stayed where I was, my hand still holding his, my resolve hardening with every passing moment. He had spent his life being my shield, my strength, my constant, and now it was my turn to do the same for him. Whatever it took, however hard it became, I wasn't going to let him face this alone, not anymore. The morning stretched on, the soft hum of the machines filling the room as I sat quietly by Adil's side. Nurses came and went, their movements efficient and purposeful, but none of them lingered. Each time the door clicked shut, the room seemed to grow smaller, the weight of everything pressing in on me. Adil drifted in and out of sleep, his face pale and drawn, his breaths shallow but steady. As the sunlight began to stream weakly through the window, a sudden thought gripped me. There were things I didn't know about him, things I had never asked. He had been my protector for so long that I had taken him for granted, assuming there would always be more time to understand the man behind the role he played in my life. But what if there wasn't? What if time was running out faster than I could hold on to it? "Adil," I said softly, leaning closer. His eyes fluttered open, and he turned his head slightly toward me, his gaze heavy with fatigue. He murmured, his voice barely audible. "There's something I need to know," I began, hesitating as I tried to find the right words. "Why did you take me in? All those years ago, when you didn't have to. Why did you do it?" He blinked slowly, his lips curving into a faint, wistful smile. "You really want to talk about that now?" he asked, his voice weak but teasing. "Yes," I said firmly. "I need to know. I need to understand." He was quiet for a moment, his eyes drifting toward the ceiling as if he were searching for the right place to begin. "You reminded me of myself," he said finally, his voice soft but steady. "Lost, alone, angry at the world but too scared to show it. I saw you, and I thought, if someone had been there for me, maybe my life would have turned out differently." His words struck a chord deep within me, and I felt a lump rise in my throat. "But you didn't have to do what you did," I said. "You gave me everything, even when you didn't have much to give." Adil's gaze shifted back to me, and there was a flicker of something in his eyes, a mix of sadness and pride. "You deserved better than the hand you were dealt," he said. "I couldn't change my own past, but I could make sure you had a future. That was enough for me." Tears stung my eyes, and I quickly blinked them away. "You changed my life," I said, my voice trembling. "You saved me. And I don't think I ever really told you how much that meant to me." "You didn't have to," he said, with a faint smile. "I saw it every day, in the way you grew, in the way you fought to find your place in the world. That was enough for me." I swallowed hard, the weight of his words settling over me. He had given so much without ever asking for anything in return. And now, as I looked at him lying there, I realized how little I had given back. "I should have been there for you," I said, my voice cracking. "I should have seen what you were going through." Adil shook his head weakly, his expression softening. "Don't do that to yourself," he said. "I made my choices. I did what I thought was right, and I'd do it all again if it meant you'd end up where you are now." The tears spilled over then, and I didn't bother wiping them away. "But where I am now," I said, my voice trembling, "is right here, and I'm not leaving you, Adil, not this time." He closed his eyes, a faint smile lingering on his lips. "I know," he said softly. "I know." I sat back in the chair, gripping his hand tightly as I let the silence settle over us once more. There was still so much I didn't know, so much I wanted to say, but for now, I let the moment speak for itself. Adil had always been there for me, and now, for the first time, I felt like I was finally beginning to understand just how much he had sacrificed. And no matter what happened next, I was determined to be the one holding him up, even if it was for the first and last time. As the hours passed, the morning gave way to the soft hum of the afternoon. The warmth of the sunlight through the hospital window was in stark contrast to the chill in my chest. Adil had fallen back into a fitful sleep, his breath shallow but even. I sat by his side, my mind restless despite the stillness of the room. Every moment felt heavy, each second stretching into what felt like eternity. I thought about his words, the quiet confession he had given me earlier. He had seen himself in me, a reflection of his own pain, his own struggles. He had saved me because no one had saved him. That realization cut deep, sharper than I could have imagined. All these years, I had looked up to him as someone unshakable, someone who always knew what to do. But beneath that strength had been a man carrying scars I had never seen. A soft knock at the door broke through my thoughts, and I turned to see the nurse from the night before. She stepped in quietly, holding a clipboard against her chest. "How's he doing?" she asked, her voice low, as though she didn't want to disturb him. "He's been sleeping," I said, my own voice barely above a whisper. "But he talked to me earlier. He's trying to stay strong." The nurse nodded, her expression gentle but serious. "That's who he is, isn't it? Always trying to carry everything on his own." I let out a shaky breath, nodding. It's who he's always been. I just didn't see how much it was costing him. She approached the monitors, checking his vitals before glancing at me. "People like him don't ask for help easily," she said. "They give and give until there's nothing left, and even then, they'll still try to give more." Her words hit hard because they were the truth I hadn't wanted to face. Adil had given everything to protect me, and in doing so, he had slowly broken himself. I watched her work in silence, the beeping of the machines punctuating the quiet. Is he going to get better?" I asked, the question slipping out before I could stop myself. The nurse hesitated, her eyes soft as she turned to me. "He's fighting," she said carefully. "But his body is tired. The best thing you can do now is be here for him. Let him know he's not alone." I nodded, my throat tight with unshed tears. "I don't think he knows how to let people be there for him," I said. "He's spent his whole life trying to be the strong one." She gave me a small, understanding smile. "Then it's your turn to be strong for him," she said, "even if it's just by sitting here and holding his hand." With that, she left, the door clicking softly shut behind her. I turned back to Adil, his face peaceful in sleep, though the faint lines of pain still lingered. The nurse's words echoed in my mind. Be strong for him. I wasn't sure if I even knew how to do that, but I had to try. For him. Reaching out, I took his hand in mine, holding it tightly as I leaned closer. "Adil," I said softly, even though I knew he was still asleep. "You've spent your whole life being my strength, but you don't have to anymore. I'm here now. I'm not going anywhere." His fingers twitched faintly, the smallest response, but it was enough to bring a wave of emotion crashing over me. For the first time, I didn't feel powerless. I didn't know what the future held or how much time we had, but I knew one thing. I wasn't going to let him carry this alone. Not anymore. The hours blurred into one another as the day continued, the stillness of the hospital room broken only by the soft hum of machines and the occasional shuffle of footsteps in the hallway. Adil remained asleep, his chest rising and falling in an uneven rhythm that kept me on edge. I held his hand tightly, as if the simple act of holding on could tether him more firmly to this world. Memories swirled in my mind, vivid and relentless. I thought of the nights I had cried myself to sleep as a child, only to wake up and find Adil sitting quietly beside my bed, his presence a silent promise that I wasn't alone. I thought of the countless times he had put himself in harm's way to shield me, standing tall and unflinching in the face of dangers that would have sent others running. He had always been my unbreakable shield, my unwavering protector. but now, as I sat here watching him fight for every breath, I realized how fragile that strength had always been. The sound of the door creaking open pulled me from my thoughts. A doctor stepped in, his expression calm but unreadable. He carried a clipboard in one hand, his gaze flicking briefly to Adil before settling on me. "May I have a word?" he asked, his voice low and professional. I nodded, my heart sinking as I carefully let go of Adil's hand and followed the doctor into the hallway. The sterile brightness of the corridor felt jarring after the dim, quiet room. The doctor turned to face me, his expression steady but kind. "We've reviewed his latest tests," he began, his tone measured. "Adil's condition remains critical. His body is weak, and while he's stable for now, there are underlying complications that need to be addressed." I felt my stomach twist, dread clawing its way up my throat. "What kind of complications?" I asked, my voice trembling. The doctor hesitated for a moment, then continued. "His organs are under significant strain, likely due to prolonged stress and neglect. He's been pushing himself beyond his limits for a long time. At this point, his recovery depends not just on medical intervention, but on his own will to fight." His words hit me like a punch to the gut. Adil's will to fight. The very thing that had always seemed so unshakable now felt precariously fragile. I nodded numbly, unable to form a response. The doctor placed a reassuring hand on my shoulder. "He's fortunate to have someone like you by his side," he said. "Sometimes, knowing they're not alone can make all the difference." I swallowed hard, blinking back tears as I managed to whisper, "Thank you." He nodded and stepped away, leaving me alone in the hallway. I stood there for a moment, my mind racing. Adil had always been the fighter, the one who faced the world head-on without hesitation. But now, it was my turn to fight for him, to remind him that he didn't have to do this alone. When I returned to the room, Adil's eyes were open, though they were clouded with exhaustion. He turned his head slightly, his gaze meeting mine as I walked toward him. "What did the doctor say?" he asked, his voice weak but steady. I hesitated, forcing a smile as I sat back down beside him. "That you're stubborn," I said lightly, squeezing his hand. "And that you need to stop trying to do everything on your own." A faint chuckle escaped him, though it quickly turned into a cough. I reached for the glass of water on the bedside table, helping him take a small sip. When he leaned back against the pillows, he looked at me with an expression that was both weary and grateful. "I don't know how to stop," he admitted quietly. "It's all I've ever known." I leaned closer, my voice soft but firm. "Then let me help you," I said. "You've spent your whole life taking care of me. It's my turn now. You don't have to do this alone anymore, Adil. Not ever again." His eyes glistened, a flicker of vulnerability breaking through the wall he had always kept up. For the first time, he didn't argue. He simply nodded, his hand tightening around mine. It was a small gesture, but it spoke volumes. And in that moment, I realized something important. Even the strongest among us need someone to lean on. Adil had been my protector, my constant, my everything. Now, it was my turn to be his. The day turned into evening, the sunlight outside fading into soft hues of orange and pink. The glow filtered through the hospital blinds, casting long shadows across the room. Adil remained awake this time, his eyes half-lidded but focused on me, as if my presence gave him some measure of peace. It was a fragile kind of calm, one that felt like it could shatter at any moment. "Do you remember?" he began, his voice rasping but steady. "The time you came to me with that stray dog you found. What did you call it? Lucky?" I smiled faintly, the memory surfacing despite the heaviness in my heart. "You didn't want me to keep him," I replied. "Said it was too much responsibility, but you ended up building a little shelter for him in the backyard." Adil chuckled weakly, a shadow of his usual laugh. "You were so determined to save him," he said. And I thought, this kid, This kid's going to save everyone if they can. I shook my head, my smile fading. But I couldn't save you, I said, my voice cracking. I couldn't even see what you were going through. He reached out weakly, his hand brushing against mine. You've saved me in more ways than you know, he said, his gaze locking onto mine. You gave me something to fight for, to believe in. You were my reason to keep going. Tears welled in my eyes, spilling over as I held his hand tightly. Then keep fighting, I said, my voice trembling. For me. Don't give up now, Adil, please. He sighed softly, his chest rising and falling with effort. I'm trying, he said, but I'm tired, so damn tired. I felt the words like a knife to my heart, their weight unbearable. I had never seen him like this, open, vulnerable, admitting the weakness he had hidden for so long. It scared me more than I could put into words. You don't have to do it alone anymore, I said, leaning closer. You don't have to carry everything by yourself. I'm here, Adil. I'll carry it with you. Just don't leave me. He looked at me, his eyes softening as if he wanted to ease my pain, but didn't know how. I'll do my best, he said quietly. But you have to promise me something. Anything, I said quickly, desperate to give him anything he needed. Promise me, he said, his voice barely above a whisper, that you'll live. That no matter what happens, you won't let this stop you from finding happiness. The tears came harder now, my chest aching with the weight of his words. Don't talk like that, I begged. You're going to get through this. We're going to get through this together. Adil's faint smile returned, but it was tinged with sadness. Just promise me, he said. For me. I nodded through my tears, my voice breaking as I whispered, I promise. He closed his eyes, his grip on my hand loosening slightly. For a moment, I panicked, thinking he was slipping away, but his breathing remained steady, if weak. I sat there, clutching his hand, my mind a whirlwind of fear and determination. I couldn't lose him. Not like this. Not after everything we had been through. I didn't know how to hold him together, how to fix what was broken, but I knew one thing. I wouldn't let him give up. Not while there was still a chance, no matter how small. The room grew darker as the sun dipped below the horizon, the faint hum of the machines filling the silence. I stayed by his side, my heart heavy but resolute. Whatever came next, I would be here. For him. Always.